meeting of the Standards, Procedure and Public Appointments Committee in 2025. I have received apologies this morning from Ruth Maguire, and so can I welcome Rona Mackay as her substitute member today. And I've had an indication that Annie Wells is running slightly late. We'll see whether or not she makes it, but if not, she extends her apologies as well. Before we turn to our main agenda item today, I would like to note for the record that further to our meeting on the 20th of February, the committee has agreed to re-accord recognition to the cross-party group on Taiwan following further examination of records regarding the group's compliance with the Code of Conduct. And our first agenda item today, committee, is to agree to take item 3 in private, and this will be a discussion on the evidence that hopefully we are about to hear. Are the committee in agreement with that? I'm grateful. And our second item is indeed to take evidence in the second in a series of 4 oral evidence sessions on our committee effectiveness inquiry. Our inquiry is seeking to answer the question, are there changes to the Parliament's procedures and practices which would help committees to work more effectively? Our call for written views on the inquiry to political parties, committees, individual members closes this Friday, the 4th of April, and the call for views from the public runs through until Tuesday, the 22nd of April. Today, we are seeking to explore committee effectiveness in the context of the culture of the Scottish Parliament, as well as gathering broader perspectives on areas that were raised in our previous session on the 20th of March, which focused on how committees are viewed externally and how their impact is evaluated. And we are joined online by our committee inquiry advisor, Dr. Daniel Bezic. And I'd also like to welcome the panel who are going to give evidence, which is Professor Paul Kearney, Professor of Politics, Public Policy at the University of Stirling, Dr. Tom Gagill, Senior Lecturer in Politics at Nottingham Trent University, Ken Hughes, the former Assistant Chief Executive at the Scottish Parliament, and Professor Christina Leston Bandera, who's Professor of Politics at the University of Leeds. Can I welcome you all to committee this morning? This is a roundtable evidence session, and whilst there will be the usual approach to questions from members to witnesses, it's intended that there will also be an opportunity for a discussion between the witnesses to encourage a more open and free-flowing evidence session. There is no expectation that all witnesses will answer all questions, and if anyone wishes to come in on a question or a response made by another witness, if you can just indicate, I'll bring you in at the appropriate moment. And on that, let us move to our opening gambit of questions, which falls to me as convenient to kick off. And I'm going to come to you, Professor Kearney, in the first instance, because I know in the past that you've done a huge amount of work in relation to government legislation and the valuability achievement of the scrutiny of that legislation. And certainly in the past, you were critical of the effectiveness of that scrutiny. And I was just wondering whether that view still stands, or have you seen changes by way of improvement, or perhaps changes the other way? So if I can come to you, Professor.
Okay, thank you. I didn't realise I'd been critical. Constructive. Okay. With a colleague, Mark Shepherd, we used to study the legislative process in terms of the amendments that people would make to legislation. And I suppose increasingly, I think, if I am critical of something, it's the imbalance between the government and the Parliament. It's that the Parliament doesn't have sufficient resources to perform that role effectively. So I think that really comes to a point with complex legislation where essentially you have a quite well-resourced team in government who is putting together that legislation and providing a bill. And then there's an expectation on MSPs who have to be generalists to suddenly become experts in anything they process. And I think that's one of the issues. And it would come to a point where, towards the end of a 4-year term, there was quite a lot of legislation to process, and suddenly there were these additional concerns. I remember the presiding officer used to use this word "bounced." I'm worried that we're being bounced with this legislation. Given too late. So I think that was the feel then. And I think it was significant then because that was still when we were talking about new politics and how everything was going to be great. And so I think, that's probably why I always seem critical, because we're comparing this aspiration with the kind of more humdrum disappointing reality. Well, I mean, that's just in general. That's not just the Scottish politics. But then, since then, so I supervised a PhD by someone, Stephen McGregor, who I think you're known to the committee, and he works in the Scottish Government as part of, he oversees bill teams, and he's actually much more positive about the process. Oh, yeah, shocker. But more complimentary of the Parliament, and I think that's the thing. So I'm always a bit suspicious when someone in government is complimentary of how the Parliament is doing, because I think, well, it's kind of buttering people up to draw attention away from any problems. So, no, I mean, that's not what he did, because, it's rigorous research and that sort of thing. But there is an interpretive side, which is to try and work out what would good, effective scrutiny look like. And I think for him, it would be the government is respectful of Parliament in terms of when it presents legislation, how it responds to suggestions. It proposes most amendments in line with concerns from committees. And so you don't see that in the figures. All you see is lots of government processing when actually it's in response to parliamentary concerns. So I think that's a more kind of positive account I can give you.
That's very helpful. I suppose, interestingly, you talk about the resource imbalance, in essence. So, I mean, if there was unlimited resources, great. Let's have a massive parliament, a massive government. Nothing else happens in Scotland. Is there something in the procedures about the requirement of timing, creating resource by way of time between things? Now, obviously, we're looking at committee effectiveness. It sits within the structure of when the committees get bills. But do you think there's something to be said for looking at that wider area? You talk about approaching, the fourth year into the fifth year, where there is always a bulk of legislation comes through, which is understandable. Is it worth looking at those timeframes and making them more explicit to balance it out? And would that be reasonable for a government to have to operate under that constraint, do you think?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, so my impression, I'm no big expert, but my impression is that there are these kind of informal understandings between government and Parliament about giving them as much time as possible. And I think there's a kind of useful, vague language there, as far as practicable, we will give you this as soon as we can, sort of thing. So I think there's already that expectation, and then it's just a case of how they would negotiate what is reasonable from each perspective. So I think from the government's perspective, the later the better, because it gives them more time to work on it. But from the Parliament's perspective, it's not good. So I think it's a negotiation, isn't it? I'll save more. I do have thoughts on other things. I'll give you less bland thoughts on other things later.
Well, I'm sure we'll come to that in the range that we want to talk about. I mean, it was interesting in our last panel session, there was a discussion about to whom the committees have a responsibility, and there was a fascinating discussion about the perspective of the sort of public being made front and centre of the work of committees, particularly with regard to scrutiny. I mean, I suppose this is broader to all of the panel members. Is there a view that the Scottish Parliament itself is achieving and prioritising public issues over party political issues, over subjective MSP's own issues? Are we giving enough credit to what is worrying the public? I don't know if Ken, do you want to chip in? And then I'll come to you, Christina.
Thank you. Well, no, the thing that immediately springs to mind is the work that we... Sorry, I have to stop saying we. The Parliament did via the Commission on Parliamentary Reform, because Parliament was doing a lot of public engagement work, but certainly not to the extent that we've done. The Parliament's done post Commission work. In terms of setting up a dedicated engagement unit, did all that because there was a recognition that basically to improve scrutiny, and then you go back to, well, what is scrutiny? Well, scrutiny, like all parliamentary activity, is actually about improving public policy for the good of all. So that would suggest that you have got to broaden the net as wide as you can to have people that are affected by those policies or proposed policies to have a view on it, and in existing policies to say how the existing policies help them. So it's a huge deal to create a lot of resource into bringing the voices in. And again, it probably still is a struggle. It's getting beyond the usual suspects, which is a huge problem. Sorry.
I was going to say, so on that point, we have a vehicle that is outward-looking and reaches out to the public. We have Petitions Committee, which, on many accounts is both well-received and is effective. Do we need to take the next step, which is using the skills that we have to be outward-looking for involving the public, both in the building and in certain parts of it, to, I suppose, mine into that resource for the purposes of scrutiny for bills much more specifically at individual committee levels? Would that assist, do you think?
I think it would assist greatly, and I think actually committees, or some committees at least, cry out for that. I mean, they see that as essentially the missing link, as I say, to get beyond the usual suspects, who are good at what they do, and the usual suspects are usually there to represent a broad range of views. But there's absolutely nothing more powerful, in my opinion, for a committee to actually speak to people that are really affected by it, and they're not talking to a representative, they're talking to real people that are really affected by it. And in terms of evidence sessions, whether that's to do with legislation or broader matters, that always seems to be the most powerful testimony, is when you do get people in that are affected beyond the representative groups. And I have to say, the representative groups have a role in identifying who these other people could be. But yeah, I mean, I think it's really important.
Thank you, Ken. That helps, because I can remind people that the public call for views is open until Tuesday, the 22nd of April. Christina, can I come to you on that point then as well?
Yes, I mean, I don't think you'd be surprised that I would say that it's crucial. I mean, the Scottish Parliament is actually very well known internationally, I'd say, by how well it involves the public in terms of the participation in the committee team, in terms of all the work they do, the deliberative democracy exercise you have, the lived experiences panels, and there is a strong concern of going out to seldom heard groups and trying to involve them, which is a difficult thing to do, but there is at least that perception, which might not exist in lots of other parliaments. What I would say is that maybe there should be more thinking about bringing in the public earlier than that. So rather than going out to the public, rather than going to see, look for the audiences, the groups that are affected by a bill or by an inquiry, whatever it may be, actually taking a step back and think about what does the public want to hear about? What are the issues that affect the public? And that's part of a wider piece of work in terms of showing the relevance of the Parliament to the people, but the relevance of committees. And actually, I think committees have got an excellent opportunity there to do that, because as we know, committees, they deal with the detail, with the specific issues that affect us every day. But does the public know that? Does the public realise the relevance of committees to their lives? So, there's innovations out there, such as instead of calling for the views of the public on inquiry, asking the public what inquiry should we do, or where there's legislation needed. And you mentioned the Petitions Committee, and obviously the Petitions Committee in this Parliament has got a very long tradition and it's got a very important role. But I would say that there could be more work in actually linking petitions to what the committees are doing. So there's incoming mechanisms into the Parliament that maybe are not being used, such as petitions, but also MSPs, post packs. You are the ones who deal with constituents every day, and obviously you can't refer all issues to committees, but you sort of develop a sense of where are those concerns. So it's more about thinking what are the mechanisms to bring for the public to shape your own agenda.
And that, if it was done earlier on in whatever the process we're talking about is, would have the advantage of being able then to say this Parliament is prioritising you, the public's issues, from that early sharing of postbag, the role of petitions. But as you say, that interesting thought of much earlier on in a committee, reaching out to say, what do you think you, the public, would like us to do, would be helpful. Would that be fair conclusion to draw, hopefully? No pressure.
Absolutely, absolutely. Obviously, it's not necessarily something you do all the time, but it's something that a committee could do, could decide, when do we want to do this and what should we prioritise in terms of areas or whatever it may be. And it might be that you even choose an area, say the Education Committee chooses an area, I don't know, support for special needs or primary schools or whatever it may be, and then trying to understand what are the issues that people really are a concern to them. And there's little things like, in Chile, for instance, they have thematic days that committees have, where they try to find out what are the issues around a theme. The House of Commons, the Science Technology Committee, has done things like call for views for inquiry. So there's little things like that could be experimented. But, I mean, this Parliament has got so much innovation, so many ideas. I'm sure you'd come up with something even better than that.
Thank you. Joe, are you all right if I come to you?
Thanks.
Thank you.
My question is around trying to ask you guys to put a bit of context around where we're at and how people look at the Parliament. So I guess the first couple of questions, I'll put the two out there and answer whichever bit that you feel you want to. First is about what is unique about the Scottish Parliament's system in terms of the mechanisms and that affect its effectiveness. And the second part to that is, how has the judgment of how effective the Parliament is and the Parliament's committees are effective influenced by historical culture? So Professor Carney mentioned a bit about what the expectations were. So how has that kind of developed in terms of what we're expecting from the Scottish Parliament committees, and has it influenced how the Parliament has evolved? Dr. Keegle, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. So a couple of points in relation to what I think is unique about Scottish Parliament committees. I think, first of all, it links back to kind of the establishment of the Parliament and linking back to kind of the Nordic model of legislatures and having quite small specialist committees. And I think size does matter in terms of effectiveness in relation to the number of members, on the basis that if we are trying to achieve consensus, the fewer members there are, the easier it is to achieve consensus. And I think generally we argue that somewhere between 7 and 11 members tends to be the kind of sweet spot in terms of being able to reach consensus across a wide range of political views and ideologies as well. So I think the size of membership matters. And I think as well the support services that committees receive. And I think the support service, particularly with the building of SPICE and the work that colleagues do in SPICE in terms of supporting committees, I think does stand out. 'Cause I think from my perspective, from kind of having done research in Westminster, and you don't quite kind of see the link quite as clearly between the committee system and, say, the House of Commons and House of Lords libraries. Although the link is there, it's not quite as, I guess, that personalised connection, which you can kind of tend to see in the committee system here as well. I think the kind of third thing I'd add there as well in terms of unique is the kind of combining of those functions of legislative scrutiny and holding the government to account as well. And I think there are kind of pros and cons to that approach. Of course, the kind of specialisation in terms of legislative scrutiny plus being able to then hold the government to account in the exact same area, as opposed to in Westminster splitting the committee systems and then having less specialism in the kind of legislative committee system in particular. But there are obviously challenges that come with that as well. In the research that I've been doing with in SPICE on post-legislative scrutiny, I think one of the bigger challenges that's come out for a number of committees, members and officials that I've spoken to, has been the amount of referred work that committees receive that limits committees' ability to undertake their own initiated work. I think that is kind of one of the bigger challenges, that perhaps it comes from the uniqueness of the system. And I guess I said that there are benefits to that uniqueness in terms of combining the functions, but I think there is a challenge there as well in terms of how much a committee is being led by government initiative versus their own initiative as well. I think it links back into the question around, are we covering topics that matter to the public as well? Because if the government is kind of, particularly for more legislatively intensive committees, if the government's legislative programme is dominating their programme, understandably, that means that, I guess, other priorities, might be on the work programme, but are lower down the list as well.
Professor Kearney?
Yeah, I mean, so the only things I would put on top of that would be, so I remember people kind of gnashing their teeth about committee size and the trade-offs in terms of each committee's size. But then I think the problem that they faced was the size of each committee was then determined how many committees people maybe had to be on if it was, you know, so some people were juggling 2 or 3. And if you take out, there's only 129 MSPs minus anyone who would want to be in the government. It's a tiny amount, so it's the cumulative effect of the size that matters there. And I think that undermines this sense that the combination of these two functions of the committees were supposed to make each MSP an expert in their subject. But I mean, I don't know how you would have the time to become an expert if you're doing 3 committees and constituency work and that sort of thing. So I think that's the issue. So I think it's just one of those things about trade-offs in terms of, you know, so I think if the priority was more specialisation among MSPs to become subject experts, then there would be clear recommendations, you know, bigger size, less attendance on other committees or something like that. But I think the problem you've got is just these, you've got a whole bunch of things you want to do, you know, so that's always going to be a tension there.
Thanks. Ken.
Thank you. There's so many issues related to this. Really are. I mean, historically, when we were setting, I mean, I remember my own fair hand that I designed the clerking structure for both committee office and chamber office, and come reality, I woefully underestimated what we needed. But looking back, the expectation was that A, we wouldn't have as many committees, and B, they wouldn't be as busy. Going back to the comment made earlier about in the first session, we're getting too much legislation. I mean, that was a comment, we're getting too much. I remember being at the Bureau, first session of the Bureau, and the government coming and saying, we've got too much PQs, we can't cope with it. But I understood completely what they meant, because I was once a civil servant, and I worked in a few policy areas. And it was a red letter day if you got an oral PQ. It really was quite unusual. In certainly areas I worked. And written PQs, you didn't get that many. Now we get, I looked at the bulletin the other day, we're averaging maybe, this is just written PQs, 9,000 a year. So we just didn't expect all that, to be frank. And so what you've got now in terms of resource for committees, for example, is a resource that's baked in, that stems from the number of members. And as was said, once you take out government ministers, front benches and stuff, there isn't a lot to juggle with at all. So there's that constraint, there's a built-in constraint. And after that, and if I can just say one more thing about, I think we, in terms of public perception, historical and otherwise, of committees, I think it's probably we get unfairly compared with Westminster committees. And I think it is unfair because, and I've had this thought for a number of years, that the things that the public see, or tend to see most of in terms of Westminster, are when you've got the heads of banks, heads of utilities, public bodies, not ministers, everybody apart from ministers in front of a PAC or whatever, and every member's having a good question session with it. And why is that? Well, that is because there's no government, there's no wagons to be circled in terms of protecting party positions, because everybody's got that single focus of this. And we have it too. Recently, universities, ferries. That is when the public perception is at its best in terms of the effectiveness of committees. So I think that's unfair, and that they don't realise that the Scottish Parliament actually does the same thing. But broadly, probably 90% of committee work isn't that alluring, but it's hugely necessary and hugely important. And Parliament probably will never get the credit for it, but it's hugely necessary work. Yeah, stop there.
Thanks very much. I guess part of what you're saying begs the question of whether we should be doing an inquiry into the number of MSPs in terms of to be effective, but maybe that's for a different inquiry, convener. Professor Bandera, just before bringing you in on those things, if I can just chuck in a couple of other areas that you might want to comment on, and just it'd be just good to hear if there's other areas where actually the Scottish Parliament system is working really well, that we should be making sure we're highlighting. And is there any lessons from other legislatures that we should be like they're doing that really well, we could do that here, we could learn from wherever?
Yeah. Thank you. So in terms of what one of the things that Scottish Parliament does really well, and I mentioned already before, is PACT. I won't say participation in the committee team, but maybe I'm getting it wrong, but you know what I mean, the support that you get. And also, going back to what Tom was saying before, the fact that you have a team approach to committees, that's so important in terms of having, you know, engagement, the clerk, media, everyone working together, which not all parliaments have. And that's and including SPICE, and that's something that maybe sometimes you take for granted, but actually it provides a really important support, because it enables you to look at the issue you're addressing from a different perspectives and to communicate outside, have the support from SPICE, etc. So that's something really, really valuable that shouldn't be taken for granted. I'd say also that in terms of you mentioned the historical and how the Parliament was set up, and of course going back to the core principles in terms of the idea of openness and participation and the idea of being community-based. This has always been a Parliament that's been more, at least in theory, in terms of wishes to be more community-based. Maybe that can be strengthened. Although there are committee visits, but maybe it's, committee meetings elsewhere, coming back to the idea earlier about public setting, shaping the agenda, so maybe that could be reinforced. But I also like to stretch it to beyond the actual committee work, committee support, and think about other areas of the Parliament, such as education and outreach. There is sometimes a tendency in parliaments to think of education does a job, outreach they do a job, which is educating the public about what Parliament does. And then we committees do another work, or we parliamentary business do another work. And you shouldn't disregard how much that area could actually do in terms of supporting the work of committees, in terms of making it more visible. It's about showing the relevance of what committees do to the public. And I was looking at your exhibition downstairs. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, but it's really good in terms of the leader videos. And there's a great story by Kevin in terms of care, growing in care, and about the work of the committee of that. Those sort of stories are really, really powerful. And yet, if I look at the website, for instance, I can't really see them there. And I'm not saying the ordinary citizen goes to the Parliament website, but it's about communicating those stories. So what I'm trying to refer to there is about working more closely with those other outer services, which might seem not relevant, but actually they are very important if you want to communicate the relevance of committee work to the public. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you.
To come back on the question of specialism and expertise and the support, the brilliant support that is given around committees, can that offset the lack of expertise within MSPs that sit on committees? Is it a safe counterbalance, or should there be a level of expertise that MSPs hold in relation to committee work? Don't know who wants to have a go at that. Christina, do you want?
Having taught parliaments for over 30 years, I always make the point that members can't be experts on everything. Members really need the support there to enable them to develop the expertise when they need it. So it's a balance, obviously, it's a balance, and I know issues of turnover can be a problem. And it's also about, ultimately, the interest for members, what actually they're really interested, because if they're really interested and passionate, they really will go for it. But ultimately, that wider network of support, of expertise needs to be there. And that might be from SPICE, it might be from also outside organisations, working with partners outside the Parliament, which I know, again, that's something that the Scottish Parliament is quite well known for, to work more with outside organisations. And And obviously, there's also always issues of bias and balance, but the staff are very well trained to deal with those issues. But you can get that expertise from there also. And again, and from the public. The public can bring you the expertise. They can bring you the lived experiences. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't think members should be absolute experts on things. I think it's important, but actually what more important is the network and the support that they get.
Tom, did you want to comment, or Ken? Or just agree?
Yeah, I think I just kind of broadly agree with what Christine said. I mean, this is what evidence sessions really afford, to kind of draw in that expertise. So, yeah, we can't expect members to be experts and everything. And I was going to raise the issue of turnover as well, which again, sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. It's just a fact of the way in which things operate, and it happens in other parliaments as well. If there's a way to kind of reduce turnover, I've no idea how we go about doing that. Perhaps, yeah, it's a question coming back to what Ken was saying about the kind of number of MSPs that we have in the Parliament, which again is out the remit of this inquiry anyway. But if you could kind of stabilise turnover, then I guess there would be an element there of being able to build expertise over a 5-year session, and then should someone be reappointed to a committee again in the following session, then further expertise being built. Because there was an example from some of the post-legislative scrutiny inquiries that I've been looking into in terms of case studies where there was a member who had sat on the committee and scrutinised the legislation as it first went through, and in the following session they were conducting post-leg on it as well. So they were developing expertise in that legislation because they were aware of the issues that had been debated during the course of the original passage, which were then kind of coming back up as issues during post-ledgers as well. So I think where members are able to kind of sit on a committee for at least for a full session, if not for longer, there is a kind of development of kind of expertise there as well. But again, I appreciate that's a rarity rather than the commonality among members.
Ken?
Can I just add, I mean, in my humble opinion, I don't think it'd be a good thing necessarily if you had a committee full of experts. Because if you're an expert in a subject, you'll have your own opinions on what you think, and it's actually good to have an open mind receiving new information. So, yeah.
That's very helpful, because there's been a number of questions or discussions about that balance between the expertise of MSPs that sit as compared to the specialism that sits around them. But I think, as you point out, Tom, there is a value, sometimes an institutional memory within MSPs of a journey a piece of legislation has taken. But as you point out, Christina, actually there are experts from the public all the way through that can offset the need for specialists. And then, exactly as to you say, Ken, maybe you don't want specialists making the decisions, but to be doing the evidence. Rona, can I come to you?
Convener, yes. Good morning, panel. I mean, firstly, can I just say I think all of your comments have been really valuable, and I actually agree with them all. I want to go back to something Professor Kearney raised, and I also do want to actually blow our own trumpet here in the Parliament, because we have a huge legislative workload for a small number of MSPs. I'm the chief whip for my party, which is a party of government, so I kind of have to get people on committees. So all of my group are on 2 or 3 committees in effectively a 3-day week here in Parliament. So that kind of gets into context the time that we have. And I think we all agree we'd love to do more scrutiny. I think it's essential, but it's a time versus people type thing. It's really, really difficult to do that. And, regarding specialists, I would always try and match somebody up to a committee that they have either an interest in or maybe a background in before coming in here. Not always possible, but, you do your best. And we have a huge turnover because people come off the back benches to go into government. That requires a reshuffle of committees, and it's pretty much constant. So that's me pointing out the sort of the challenges, I suppose, within our system. But we do try to do that. I mean, and I believe in trying not to disrupt committees if I can, keep people on it so that they can get comfortable and get to know the subject better. I've been on the Criminal Justice Committee since 2016, since I was elected. I'm by no means an expert, but I feel confident on it because I've been there, so long, and I can reflect in previous legislation. But I wanted to sort of just point out and see if you had any ideas about, at this time of year, we are facing, the sort of I suppose we call it a rush, but a number of stage 2s and 3s that have to be done by end of this session. And do you think we could organise that better so that, you know, we weren't facing just quite so much? It happens every year, and Joe's been here longer than me. He'll attest to that. But I'm just wondering if you'd any suggestions on how that could be managed better, so that we weren't suddenly, you know, stage 2s and 3s every week from now till summer.
Who would like to take that?
Like.
Tom or Ken? Ken probably.
Yes, discussed this before, obviously. The first point to make is we're not like Westminster. Would this rush to get things done by the summer, there's nothing to say it can go longer. But then, obviously, then it affects the flow, principally, of government legislative programme. But at the same time, there's no constraint on us to have things finished by the summer before we go off and then get a new set of legislation. So maybe at times, if it's necessary to do more scrutiny, certainly, particularly probably at stage 2 of a bill, maybe that period of scrutiny should be longer.
So can I come back then to, does it go back to our programme for government? Because obviously within our programme for government, we have a commitment to get legislation through. Is that possibly where it should start?
It does start there, but I can see the problems because, I mean, if you don't, if the government in particular doesn't have that tight timetable sequence of legislation, it might at one point create a logjam at the very end of the session if things, you know, just start to logjam at the end of the end of the session. But yeah, I mean, it does start with how the government programme for legislation.
Christina?
Yeah. I don't have a lot to add on this, but I was just thinking that in part it's about committees being more strategic, if they can be, where they can be from the start. So thinking of a Parliament period and thinking about, okay, so what is going to come down the pipeline? How do we need to organise ourselves to deal with that? Obviously, that's all very well said and done, but you're still dependent from the government in terms of when legislation gets through here. But some of that thinking at the beginning of the Parliament, beginning of its session, just spending time on thinking about that, about thinking what is the agenda, what is the programme, what should we prioritise, might be quite valuable. And then thinking of continental legislatures, but I realise here the numbers maybe not enable that. A couple of practices that exist is one is the rapporteur system, where a member becomes the responsible for collecting views and for reporting, which is what the rapporteur term refers to on specific bills. Another one is subgroups. So in some parliaments, committees then have subgroups. But I realise the subgroups here would be quite difficult to do. But so subgroups that then focus on that committee, on that bill, on that legislation, and then report back to the larger committee. I don't know if either of those would be suitable, but again, together with strategy and thinking beforehand, might be a way forward.
So looking back to last session, I mean, you talk about subgroups, subcommittees. So we had I was on the Justice Committee, and we had a police subcommittee, and I was on that too. Now, it simply isn't possible to do that this session because we just don't have enough people to populate that committee, and so we're dealing with everything in the one committee. And it does sort of come down to legislative workload and the number of people that are available, to get those committees. But all that said, I do think we do a really good job at it. And I totally agree with you. We've got fantastic support from the clerking teams and SPICE. And that was one of the things when I was elected in 2016, I'd never sat in a committee before because I was something else in a previous life. And I was amazed right from the start just how good the support that you got was as a member, and we can go to any of the clerks and ask them anything at any time and they'll come right back to you. So I honestly think we've got a great system for that here in all portfolios. It's really good. I think we've probably covered, my last question was about the balance between referred work and proactive inquiry work. And I think we all would love to do more proactive inquiry work. I mean, that's something we should be doing. We just always don't have the time to, and we do some. I mean, some committees do some, and it's really useful. But there's more could be done. But just the sort of logistics of it quite often doesn't allow for that. So should that be built into our workload programme, regardless, if we can do it? Do you think that would be the best plan? Professor Kearney, do you have any thoughts on it?
I do. I mean, some of the thoughts I gave up on them many years ago because no one was interested. So I'll give them one last go. I mean, so I do think strongly that there should be far more resources for the clerks and committee teams, regardless of how well they do their job. If you're talking about the need for more capacity to deal with more agenda-setting work, it needs people to be working on those things continuously rather than ad hoc. And I think it ties into things like, so I reckon, well, I've got my order of least feasible suggestion. I think my least feasible one that I like the best is that people just naturally work to deadlines with legislation. So if the deadline is every 4 or 5 years, then they'll work to it. And so, one obvious solution is to set different deadlines for legislation, to say if it doesn't appear at this point, then it's not happening in this 5-year term or something like that. But you can imagine the kind of party dynamic there. It's a sensible thing. It's just not going to happen. But now the other thing would be more pre-legislative work, so that by the time the bill comes to committees, they know much more about it than they would if they were just bounced. I think the problem that we've faced in the past is that there's this sense, particularly among opposition MSPs, I mean, this is me paraphrasing, they don't really want to help the government make their legislation. They want to scrutinise it independently. So pre-legislative work is essentially trying to work with government to shape it. And I don't think that it's agreed within the Parliament that is the role of the committees. There's this language of being business-like and all that sort of thing, but it's layered with this partisan lens, which is we are here to criticise this stuff, not to help you make it better so that you're more electable next time, that sort of thing.
I actually think you've completely nailed it there. But I think the idea of members having more of a upfront look at it and a bit more scrutiny beforehand might alleviate that, because then we're not coming to it new, as it were. Yeah, thank you.
Tom, do you want to?
Yeah, so I think just coming in on the point of pre-legislative scrutiny, I've done research and I'm in the middle of a project, aside from the post-legislative one here, pre-legislative scrutiny in Westminster. And I think, kind of building on what Paul was saying, there is an issue where obviously you are then reliant on the government bringing forward draft bills as well. And what we tend to see in Westminster is the government brings forward draft bills, which might be quite technical, but are not particularly party political, in which there's not going to be that kind of partisan battle. And that might be a reason for doing more pre-leg in terms of committee struggling with kind of technical details of very technical pieces of legislation. But actually, I think where committees might spend more time debating the principles of a piece of legislation, those bills are not necessarily going to be brought forward in draft form, because governments want to keep them quite close to their chest, because obviously either they're a key part of their policy programme, or there's been an outside incident which kind of requires an immediate response, in which the government then decides this is our response, let's get it through in the kind of shape that we want it, as quickly as we possibly can, as well. So I think, yes, there's scope to do more pre-leg, but again, it comes back to the issue of committees having the time to do it as well. And if you might be a case if you do some pre-leg, and then, okay, in Westminster it does kind of reduce the amount of time normally that kind of bill spend in committee, because there's been a look at it already. There's definitely certainly less amendments that come forward from the House of Lords as well on that basis. But I also wonder, if you spend, say, 2 months on pre-legislative scrutiny, then it goes through the normal legislative process. Maybe you end up in the exact same position in terms of the amount of time spent on legislative scrutiny as well. So I think that's something to bear in mind too. And I think the legislative workload is just incredibly difficult to manage. And often when I'm kind of teaching my students about parliaments, I often kind of ask them to kind of look to this Parliament how well in which it manages that 5-year period and the work that the Bureau does. But I appreciate, again, there are still challenges with that kind of sequencing of legislation as well, and balancing the government's right with a mandate to put forward its legislative agenda, but also the right for the Parliament to take its time and scrutinise it.
Getting that balance right. So, I mean, currently in Justice, I mean, we have 2 very big and important bills. We're doing it in tandem, and I think a lot of committees are working on more than one bill at one time. So that's the intensity of our workload. I think, Ken, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, no, sorry, just a wee point that there's, in terms of pre-alleged scrutiny, again, from the start, there was also a purist view that how can you scrutinise a bill if you're complicit in the drafting of it? And so that's formed the approach as well.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's me, convener.
I think you wanted to
So
come
I
in.
was going to come in on something else, but we're on pre-alleged scrutiny. So I think there's probably a couple of examples where I think we have, as a Parliament, managed to get that balance right. So I'm going to point to the lobbying bill, which very much was shaped. I was the Minister at the time, and it was very much shaped by the committee's work to say what this should be. Almost felt like it could have been something that would have been better as a committee bill, but committee bills are difficult. So the Parliament did manage to find a way to do that. The other example of pre-alleged scrutiny, which I hope is going to develop a bill, would be the work around conversion practices in the Equality and Human Rights. Right at the start of the session, the committee did the work and decided that it was too complex for a committee bill, so therefore asked the government. Now, we've not got there yet, but clearly the challenge is there is how, when that goes forward, all the work that the committee did in that pre-alleged scrutiny isn't just having to be redone by the government and then redone by the committee again. And I guess that's the big challenge, which brings me to my point that I was originally going to come in before we started talking about that, about the timelines. It feels to me, I joined the Parliament in the 3rd session in 2007. It feels to me that as every session goes on, bills are taking longer. I'm certain that Stephen McGregor will be able to confirm whether that's just a feeling of mine or a fact. I think it's a fact. I think we're taking, as a Parliament, longer to do all the bills, probably mainly stage 1, but good to hear your thoughts on whether that is the case.
Who would like to take that? Ken, you want to?
It's probably after my time, but it's probably... I think at a time we, as the clerking body, because we discussed it within the clerks, and that previously there was a perception that the government timetable was almost done by rote, so you'll have 6 weeks for stage 1 and 9 weeks for stage 2, and so obviously we're taking, well, it's not a one size fits all, and so as a Parliament we should at least be pushing back a wee bit on that and discussing with the government, well, no, this one's got to take longer, and so it's maybe what you're saying is maybe it's at least in part of a result of Parliament pushing back a wee bit and saying, well, actually, no, we need longer than this. But it really should be a constructive conversation between the two sides to agree. And so I would think now that if bills are taking longer, I would assume that the government has had an equal part in determining that they should, for good scrutiny reasons.
I agree with what you're saying, Ken. I think more members are putting forward far more amendments than they used to. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's definitely increased. By far, it's increased that there are far more amendments. We've just completed week 4 of a stage 2 in Justice. And, you know, that's a big bill, but there are other committees in the same boat. And that, I don't remember that happening last session. Joel, remember way back. And so it has increased. And that's just, prolonging the time for a bill to get through.
Well, I must admit I'm a great believer in Parkinson's law, that the amount of capacity you create, demand will always rise to fill it.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I just want to go back to, because there was mention made of rapporteurs and the role of rapporteurs, which in other parliaments around the world is far more developed than over here. So, I mean, as you say, a rapporteur is in essence an individual who takes responsibility to look in depth at something beyond the time that the committee have to do, and then, surprise, surprise, report back to that committee. Do you think that role of rapporteur is better suited to committee's own inquiries, or should it form a part of scrutiny? Or is it something actually that it fits depending on what the question is that's being asked? I don't know, can I come to you, Christina, first? Because I know you have an awareness of the role of rapporteurs in other places.
Yeah, I mean, the role of rapporteurs tends to be actually through more pre-legislative scrutiny. And I think that's partly why they are very useful, because it lays out the key priorities, the key points. So it's a mechanism to prioritise what should we be focusing on. And so from that perspective, obviously there's lots of different systems, but from that perspective, it can work really well to help a committee to prioritise the focus on, the scrutiny of specific clauses or whatever it may be. And so I think they are really, really useful from that perspective. Does that answer your question? I wasn't sure if I understood.
It does. It actually then prompts me on to another question that's just arisen. And in fulfilling that role, does that square that circle, Ken, that you were talking about, of the tension between a committee that's scrutinising a bill can't be seen to have in essence drafted and assisted in the bill, putting aside committee bills at the moment? Would that help keep that dynamic workable and indeed justifiable to the Scottish public? Ken?
I actually don't know. Rapporteurs were tried in session 2 to a very limited extent, and a very specific extent. What probably didn't come out was the amount of resource that needed, because you just can't send a member out and expect them to do this big body of work on their own. So they do need the clerking support, they do need the research support, and all the time that's almost double running with the committee doing its own thing. So to try and answer the question as best I can, I think it could work in a very limited, specific sense. It may well take a load off.
More limited than just pre-leg scrutiny? Or is that an area where, as Christina's pointed out, it is used elsewhere and gives a separation from the committee, from the reporter, who's always identified as such and takes a different stance in decision-making?
Yeah. I think...
Explore.
Yeah. My response would be, I think it'd be wholly determined how big and complex the bill was.
Any other... Paul?
I suppose, first off, I would change the name, because I always have to remind myself, what's a rapporteur? It sounds really pretentious, I think. I don't know what you would call it, but I would... I reckon you could use it for two things. I think in both cases, the committee would have to agree on what they were doing, and it would have to be not boring, an innocuous thing they were doing on behalf of the committee. So I could see it working for, a lot of the legislation we're talking about. It is quite boring in terms of you do not anticipate much contestation between parties on the principles, and maybe there's some details to work out. So I think there's a phenomenal amount of work is just updating legislation, or doing stuff that is just fairly innocuous, and maybe there'll be just these flashpoints. And if there's also agreed work of inquiries where essentially an inquiry, a committee might say quite routinely, we're interested in this broad topic, but we need a lot more information before we can do it justice, especially say public admin and that sort of thing. You just need someone to look at this for a long time. So I could see that working with a team if the committee had trust in the MSP leading it and there was sufficient resource amongst it didn't take away too much from routine business. And then they would just be much better prepared. And so it wouldn't matter so much that MSPs were on 3 committees, because someone had done a lot of the work for them. So I don't know, like if it comes down to practicalities, I guess every week you've got like your bundle of papers that you have to get through. And I know, like, so I do this with meetings. If I see a big one, I'm groaning. But if I see, like, a colleague has turned it into a one-pager to help us all get through it, they're heroic. You know, so I think there's probably a lot of good value in one person doing a lot of the work on behalf of the committee that essentially not everyone has to do. Not everyone has to read all the detail to work out what is not relevant. So,
Christina, do you want to?
Just a really quick comment. I'd advise you to look at the Parliament of Denmark, the Folketing. I think they'll have some interesting practice for you to work with, because they have similar issues of problems of members being in lots of committees. So I think that might be an interesting literature for you to look at. Excellent.
Thank you very much. The other thing I want to touch on, and I'm going to sort of raise it, but then I'm actually going to pass over to Sue, and it's about defining the remits of committees. Whether that helps and assists and how we do that. So I just want to float that out there, not to curtail answers to the next bit, because Joe rightly mentioned the lobbying bill and its wonderment in its pre-leg form. We're going to have a look at post-legislative scrutiny, which perhaps the lobbying bill is another example of when it should have happened and hasn't done. So, Sue, can I pass over to you?
Thanks. And I suppose some of this the questions I want to ask, you did touch on earlier on, and it's about, I suppose it's the one thing about how do we seem in here to be relevant to what's going on out there. I suppose that's my big thing, so because the connection between people and politicians is a bit draft. And we're speaking about workload and time management. There's also been a lot of evidence around the shortcomings of legislation that comes to committee, which then leads to 400, 500 amendments we've just seen go in, for example, for the education bill. So do you think it might be better to reject a draft bill at the outset if it doesn't really appear to achieve its aims? Do you get a sense that maybe the government is putting legislation forward for the sake of legislating? Sometimes it's better to be lean. And maybe how can we address some of these challenges through that process of amendments, if that makes sense? And can I come to you first, Tom, and then also the rest of the members? Thanks.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. It's one that has come up a couple of times during the course of the research that I've been doing over the course of the last 18 months. It's a question really around the government, and I guess the Parliament too, kind of justifying why a bill is being brought forward. And I wonder, actually, part of that is whether, coming back to the comments we made earlier about kind of the scheduling of legislation, whether the Parliament and the government needs to have more of a discussion about justifying, okay, yes, it's on your kind of programme for legislative programme, but is it actually necessary based on the legislation that's come before, or is the policy it's trying to implement, does it actually require legislation in the first place? And I think there was some evidence from this session where a bit of post-leg scrutiny kind of got drawn into stage one scrutiny of a new piece of legislation, and in that case, yes, the legislation was necessary, but the team from the committee kind of reviewing it in terms of, well, actually, that process of incorporating a bit of postage into stage one helped us to understand why the new piece of legislation was needed, rather than just accepting, yes, the government wants to bring forward a new bill, let's scrutinise it and let's go through stage 1 and 2 in it, so on and so forth. So I think there's certainly a case there for justification. I think that might help in terms of the kind of overall kind of workload potentially of committees too. But of course, the practicality of that is, well, how does the Parliament say no to legislation that's been brought forward? Because we know, as in most parliamentary systems, the government is the main initiator of legislation, apart from a few members' bills here and there. And what processes are in place to allow the Parliament to do that? Because outright rejecting a piece of legislation at the beginning would be seen as kind of a nuclear option against the executive, of course, of which, to be in office, governments need to have some kind of working majority or working minority as well. So it would really need to come at that kind of very formal first stage discussion about what is going to come forward, and saying, well, actually, maybe this shouldn't come forward or shouldn't formally be tabled. And I wonder if that's a question whether it's right at the start of a session between the government and the Bureau and the kind of members that sit on the Bureau as well. But that's probably more likely what would have to take place as opposed to a formal rejection.
I suppose with that, now before it comes on, the committees are loaded, in inverted commas, with members of the Parliament that are supportive of the government. So there's not really a mechanism, certainly as an opposition member, that we feel if something's coming that shouldn't be there, to really challenge and do that very thing you're talking about.
Yeah, no, that's the you're right. The absolute main challenge is, if you've got a sizable chunk of the committee is made up of the governing party, which of course it would be the case in any session, their members are going to be whipped to support that legislation and get it through the process as well. So I think it really just have to go back to kind of the almost behind the scenes discussions and negotiations about what comes forward in the first place. Because again, I'm not sure that, as you say, the mechanisms are actually there to.
Does anyone else want to come in on that? Yeah.
Just, I was trying to find, there was one bill that was rejected quite in a high-profile way on the basis that the government hadn't consulted enough with enough groups in advance. And I think that's probably one of those powers that's maybe been used remarkably little. The committee has this power to say, when you bring a bill to us, it has to be built on sufficient consultation. If it's not, it doesn't meet our threshold or something like that. But it is quite rare, and I think from memory, I think it was because there was a particular group that felt it had been excluded from the process or something like that. So it was unusual. But you could see, I think, if the relationship is working well, then that kind of action is the kind of last resort. Whereas what you would expect the government to do would be to delay or withdraw its own legislation, because the committee has signalled informally it's not happy yet, something like that. But I guess then the knock-on effect is the other stuff you were asking about before, which is that they'll withdraw it and then bring it in at the end when you're too busy to process it. So there's all these trade-offs, I guess, about what to do.
Anyone else?
It's quite a political decision when you've got government coming with a legislative programme, they've got the mandate to bring it forward for the Parliament to say, well, actually, no. It's a really big decision. I think in memory, if my personal experience was maybe two that didn't see the light of day before it even hit the Parliament. There's certainly, I recall the one that Paul's talking about, but it really is it's really quite a big decision, and it's a political decision for the government itself in bringing forward the bill. That's why I'm not going to say any more.
That's right. I suppose it does. If the committees were truly in that position of power and influence, then they would perhaps do them more. Some of the committees do focus their recommendations on policy and practice, you'll notice as well, a lot, rather than changes to legislation. So I was wondering, is this a suggestion that perhaps if they do that the changes are more likely to happen and occur, or is that there may be perceived barriers to actually making the changes to the legislation? You're nodding away, Tom, so I'm going to come to you first. Yeah,
so I've looked at this quite extensively in terms of post-legislative scrutiny, both here and in Westminster as well. So just from the research that I did on Section 5, 43% of recommendations that came from post-legislative scrutiny-based inquiries were for policy and practice changes, and legislative changes amounted for about 7% of the overall total. So I appreciate that's only for post-legislative scrutiny, and I'm sure Meg Russell's done work at Westminster looking at a wide range of committee scrutiny as well. And what's come out of the research, both actually kind of very similar from here in Westminster, has been it's better to achieve something than nothing, and actually be realistic in terms of what the committee is able to achieve, and therefore something you might have more impact in terms of suggesting a change in kind of policy and practice as opposed to trying to change legislation necessarily, because just on the basis that the government could if be able to have a majority on the issue, able to just reject any kind of amendments that come forward on new bills that maybe even the committee uses their powers to introduce a committee bill, could just utilise those powers as well. So I think so it was kind of put quite bluntly, it has been put bluntly to me here and in Westminster that, it's better to achieve something than nothing. But I think as well, it's just about being, to some degree, realistic in terms of you can't necessarily force the government to do something. You have to either use soft power and really to convince the government of why it's needed. And sometimes that soft power is you've made a really compelling case and argument. Sometimes it's about embarrassment and shame as well. That's quite brutal language. It's better to achieve something than nothing. So I was wondering if anyone else wants to come in. Christine, do you want?
No, I mean, this is not really my area. I was just
that's fine
thinking.
then, that's okay.
I was just thinking that around a lot of these issues that we're discussing, it comes down to the committees being more proactive where they can be, and to think more again strategically where they can have an impact, where it's worth spending the time, and I think that's again partly coming back to the same point, which I realise politically it's not always possible. But
Yeah. I suppose I use a lot of my where I'm sitting in my viewpoint here is from the role when I was a convener on the Education Committee, because that's and I know one of the things that in terms of making that connectivity with what was going on outside, we did an inquiry into additional support for learning, and we had so much evidence, and it was a really good report, and we delayed our report publication, or no, the government delayed their update on their action plan on additional support for learning until after our report was published, which was quite... So there seemed to be a little bit of joined-up thinking. But it's but the recommendations, there was always a mismatch about what the government perceives as going on with what the reality is on the ground. So when we come to tracking the effectiveness or the acceptance of recommendations, Audit Scotland were quite useful in some of their discussions they had yesterday in terms of making them more trackable. So I was wondering if you've got any thoughts about how the quality of the recommendations that we do can perhaps be adapted or reviewed to allow that to happen. Can I come to you again, Tom?
So I think one of the issues that's come up a couple of times is obviously because with the need of committees to come to a consensus, sometimes the recommendation might start off being very clear and direct, but in the process of achieving consensus, it's kind of being reworded and restructured. It's not quite necessarily as clear as it originally necessarily was, and I think that can be then quite difficult to track. And also then if the recommendation's a little bit more woolly in nature, then the government maybe doesn't feel quite so much kind of pressure to directly respond to it as well. But I think, I mean, this is what kind of comes back to kind of what do we mean by effectiveness as well. And effectiveness isn't just about that kind of 2-3 month period after a committee's reported and looking at what percentage of recommendations are being accepted, because of course, well, you know, recommendations could initially be rejected but be accepted 2 or 3 years down the line as the policy discussion has developed as well. I think that's where the point about tracking becomes important. I think that's a discussion for committees and the clerking teams to have in terms of what are the priority recommendations that perhaps haven't been accepted, or even ones that have been accepted that we want to monitor the implementation of as well. And it links back to a point I was going to come back to as well in terms of institutional knowledge, because I appreciate sometimes the tracking of these recommendations can take place over a course of 5 years, and that can overlap 2 different sessions as well. And if the committee staff have rotated, if members have rotated, or there's been a change in membership following an election as well, that institutional knowledge can be lost as well. So I think one of the things we're kind of working on in terms of post-ledge in particular is trying to create some kind of repository where information can be kept for future dexterity should issues rise again, or because I appreciate committees produce legacy papers at the end of each session, but it's a question of, well, how much interest does the new subsequent committee pay to that as well?
Does anyone else want to come in?
Yeah, just on the issue of tracing and tracking the recommendations, just to emphasise the point about raising awareness being so important. So even if the government doesn't do it immediately, just raising awareness of an issue might be actually a really good output. And the other point I was just going to make is about, again, working with outside organisations, whether sometimes it's possible, because I imagine that in some cases, some organisations out there will be tracking down the recommendations, what's applicable or not, and where there could be some collaboration there in terms of following through recommendations.
That's helpful.
Okay. Thank you, Sue. I was going to talk about the sort of the concept of building partnerships, and you've already given us a lot of examples of successfully how the Scottish Parliament reaches out to different groups, and the fact that, one of the things that I think we can be very proud of in the Scottish Parliament is that role of reaching out, and whether there needs to be more. There always needs to be more done about the public having confidence in that, in the bit that they fit in. But I wonder whether you have any comments really about the sort of cultural precursors that are needed for effective scrutiny. I suppose this goes back to the point I mentioned earlier about committee remits and things. What is it that makes a committee really work well when it's looking at scrutiny? on a simple terms, is it the written down procedures? Is it the set of questions that they're going to be asked? Or actually is it a cultural connectivity within that committee that brings it together? So I know it's not one or the other, it's a balance, but it's where should that balance lie? Who wants to go first on that? I'm going to look across. This brings me back to being a primary school teacher. Excellent, Ken. Can I come to you and give us
I would say it's 90% culture. Procedures, as you will know, because it's in your committee's purview, the procedures are written out to allow the Parliament to do things. It's not written, you know, apart from elections of things like First Minister and First Minister and Presiding Officer, Corporate Body, and that type of thing, which is quite prescriptive. Most of the standing orders aren't. Most of the standing orders set out bare bones. Here's something that allows you to do something, sort of style, and so and again, in my experience, the committees that work best are the ones that do gel. And there's a personal level to it, members getting on with each other. And invariably they do. Invariably they do. And I think it's I mean, it sounds a bit soft, but it really is an important factor in terms of how committees perform.
Tom? Paul, do you want to come in?
Yes,
Tom?
I think I agree with much of what Ken has said, that the personalities in the room really matter. I think it comes back to the point we talked about turnover as well, and I know there are some academics who don't think turnover matters that much, but if you're changing the dynamics of the committee by changing the membership, then you are having an impact on scrutiny and certainly having an impact on the work plan, because you may have two members who have put something onto the work plan and really want to do it, and then suddenly they leave, and then the work plan is understandably changed again as a result of that as well. And I think as well, obviously, the relationship there, I think, between the clerking team and the committee, what the relationship like is, particularly between the convener and the clerking team as well. And I guess the kind of convening style of the convener, that all matters too. So yeah, I agree with Ken. It's a lot of it, I think, is cultural in nature. And I think someone put to me, like, every committee is different. In that regard, and when I've kind of tried to explain it to students before, I've said, well, I can walk into two different seminar groups for the exact same module, and I know exactly that the seminars will be different because the people in the room, the students in the room are different. They're going to bring up different questions, different ideas, different viewpoints. So it can be on the exact same topic. I can give out the exact same questions for discussion, but the dynamic will be completely different. And I think that's true of committees as well.
You are the weather in the seminar, Tom. Christina, can I come to you? Now, are there any sort of examples? I mean, you've already mentioned the Danish Parliament, which is not dissimilar. Are there any other examples where we can look to, where we can see the importance of that cultural, that connectivity in committees as being one of the evidences of a successful committee?
I'd say anyway you look at, it'll be important, because I do think that the culture and who the members are and how they get on really matters. I agree with everything that Ken and Tom have said. And actually, it's interesting to referring to the Danish Folketing or the Swedish one, because a lot of the structures you have in this place are similar to some of those parliaments, but it don't necessarily have the same culture, because obviously it's a different country, and there's other dynamics such as the wider party political structure, etc. So in terms of other legislatures to look at, yeah, I'd say the Danish one actually is a quite good one to look at. But I'd say any parliament, you know, the committees are affected by the culture besides the structures. Something I wanted just to bring in, linking back to the public, is also coming back to that issue of culture. How much do members actually value the input from the public? And you might see that different committees will value differently because of that culture and who the members are. And so if that is the case, whether there's some work to be done to promote the value of the public input and outside organisations and building those partnerships, because culture does matter. And ultimately, I've got lots of examples in my research where was excellent public engagement undertaken, lots of inputs from the public, beautiful summary, take it to committee, and then nothing happens to it because the members don't necessarily value it. So also affected by the culture.
And sometimes no feedback to the public about why.
I also wanted to touch on that, if I may.
Yeah, please do.
Because it's what we refer to as closing the feedback loop, which we haven't really approached yet, which is so important. And it's something that parliaments do find difficult to do, because it is difficult, but it is possible to do. And it's so important for the public to have a sense of someone has listened to them, something has happened to it, even if they don't get what they ask for, but someone considered it. So closing the feedback loop is as important in maintaining that relationship between committees and public.
Did you want to come in on that point?
Just on that sort of general point, I was wondering whether you thought the public, and I don't mean interested stakeholders in committee work, I just mean the public generally, actually know about committees and the importance of them. Because, you know, if I'm talking to friends and family, let's say, who are not political, and I say, oh, you know, this committee, they kind of look at you, oh, yeah, committee, what's that about? You know, so I'm just wondering whether we're communicating enough how important our, well, committee work is, and how it's the absolute fundamentals of this Parliament, because all the public would see would be what's going on in the chamber, you know. So do you think we could do a better job of that?
I'm sure we could. I think the Scottish Parliament does an excellent job, but I'm sure there's more you can do. There's a general problem throughout the world, not specific to Scotland, that people confuse Parliament with government. So that's the first barrier to get through. And then to expect them to actually understand what committees are, it's even more difficult. But I absolutely think it's worth doing it, because committees is what is closest to people's daily lives. And so when I was talking before about the wider structures of education outreach, is exactly about that. It's about raising the visibility, almost raising the brand of committees. Why are committees important and why they have relevance to people's lives?
Yeah.
Thank you. Just to go back to... sorry, Paul, did you want to come in? My apologies. Yeah, please.
I found a way to say this positively. I think that the way you framed it there would be useful. So the more kind of critical stuff would be the word culture annoys me, because I think it's fantastically vague. I don't know what anyone means when they say it, and I think it's the same with effective. I don't think anyone knows how effective you are until you write down what it means. And it's going to mean different things to different people. And I think actually that device of, okay, I'm a committee member, I'm explaining to someone what I do, and then you're saying, okay, here's how I know that it's going well. And I think one of the stories could be, well, as soon as we come in the door, we get rid of our party hats and we work together and we're collegial, and we come up with something that goes beyond elections. So that's one story. But I think the other one, which came up maybe in 2007 and just appears periodically, is we stuck it to the government. We really exposed their failings, and we made them do something differently as a response to our scrutiny. And good luck to you if you can do both, you know, because I think you essentially go down different paths. One is you're focusing very much on what can we agree on and how can we cooperate, and the other is how can we use this committee to accentuate the competition we've got going. So I think that would be an interesting one in terms of what you tell people when you say, I'm a committee. Well, okay, what makes you successful? I would be interested in which one you would go for. Yeah.
I'll not put that to the committee if it's all right at the moment. I am slightly conscious of time, so I'm going to come to one of the committee elements, which is conveners. And if I can pass to you first, Sue, and then I'll come to you, Joe.
Thanks. I suppose this does lead on from what you were just talking about there, in terms of the culture that we have within the Scottish Parliament and how that shaped our convener role perhaps a wee bit differently to other legislators. And so what do you think are the strengths and the weaknesses of our Scottish Parliament conveners as they are right now? I'll come to you, Paul, to carry on from that.
Yeah, so I know the context is this perennial question about should they be elected as well. So
you might have someone coming to that
later
on. But you can, if you want to pick it up here, it just means it's fine.
No, I'll save that.
So no, carry on, it's fine.
Yeah, I suppose I think if we go back to the envisaged advantage, it was very much the convener. So the committees were to be the most important part of the Parliament, much more than plenary. The conveners were essentially the kind of keeper of the keys, or responsible for keeping that. thing going. And culture described this idea of getting away from needless adversarialism. So there was all this romantic language about, okay, we're going to do better than Westminster, it's too adversarial. So I think that was the envisaged role of the convener. I don't know how it works out because, you know, I think, at least when I used to pay more attention and there was a proper majority in government, the role of the convener was often to be a connection. If they were in the party of government, was to be a connection to the government to smooth relationships between them. Or if they were an opposition member, the dynamic would be different. So there was no single role for conveners. And so I don't know if that's changed, but I think, you know, there's a kind of romantic vision of a convener is they're kind of, it's a kind of non-partisan role. It's a facilitation role. I suppose that's what I would like it to be, but it's so difficult, isn't it? How do you do that? I don't know.
Do you want to come in, Ken, on that?
Yeah, I think, well, certainly, firstly picking up something that Paul said about I don't know if the romantic vision included the committees being the most important. They are. Just because they don't get as much publicity, they are. Committees do the bulk of the work of the Parliament in terms of scrutiny. They do. And so, by that measure, by that yardstick, they are the most important. Just because they don't get, you know, highlighted in sort of news bulletins on social media and stuff, I don't think necessarily detracts for the point that they are. Otherwise, without talking about elections of conveners, I think that I'm conscious with two party whip business managers, ex or otherwise, sitting in this room. I think that I think it'd be hard to deny in terms of party leadership management of the parties. Convenerships are at least partly some form of recognition or reward for the members in the party. That could well be a strength in terms of the parties themselves highlighting who they think the best people are for these certain convenerships or not. Yeah, so that's
my next sort of follow-up question, maybe Tom, you can come in first, is that there's that balance between a career convener, but then the opportunity for a convener to be a career stepping stone, and some of the churn that we've referred to are when conveners from the governing party are moved into ministerial roles. They've defended the position of government very well as their role of convener, one might perhaps challenge, and so they're then rewarded with that ministerial role. So, and how does that then connect with the esteem of holding the role of the convener? So I'm interested in your thoughts on that. Tom first maybe, and then Ken.
Yes, I mean, I know we're going to come on to the question about election shortly, but I think just kind of reflecting on the kind of Westminster experience of this, the whole point of elections in Westminster was to make an alternative career route, and for members who weren't serving in government. And I think one of the things that's worth pointing out from a Westminster perspective too is that we still do see committee chairpersons in Westminster being lifted out of their roles into government departments, and we've seen ministers leave office in Westminster and go to become chairs of House of Commons select committees as well. And I think it's important to try. It might not always be possible because again, it's up to the First Minister to decide who they want to serve in, who they want to serve in government. That means if that means calling on a convener to serve in government, that's obviously their freedom to do so. But I think it is important to try and delineate the different career routes that are possible within the legislature as well. Because I think that example in Westminster. I think the example would be Jeremy Hunt, who had been Health Secretary and then went to lead the Health and Social Care Select Committee in the House of Commons, and he was scrutinising the work of his own government department that he'd just left. And I think that has an impact on the quality of scrutiny that can be provided potentially as well. So I think it's difficult, but I think it is important to try and delineate a different career route there, where at all possible, taking into account the politics.
Ken and then Christina, yeah.
I'm afraid I don't think that's possible. Going back to what I was saying earlier about the numbers are so baked in that if you accept that the conveners have been chosen in the first place because parties think they're best suited to that role, it stands that when you have reshuffles, you would You would think that top or near the top of the list of people that would replace outgoing ministers, for example, would be convener of that party of government. And there's not any wriggle room for parties to do anything otherwise. I mean, the career structure thing that we talk about Westminster, I just don't think it's possible here because, I think, as I said in the paper I submitted to the committee, I mean, in Westminster it's a prize to be in a committee. Here it's exact, it's the exact topic when Rona talks about.
You're on 3 sometimes.
Well, is this a prize? I feel so valued. I don't think it's possible.
Christina?
Yeah, I mean, and the comparisons with Westminster are not always very helpful because the context is so different, isn't it? And the remit of committee is so different. But I do think there is a value of recognising more the role of the convener and making it, whether it's whatever the system, election, remuneration, or being more the spokesperson for the committee. I mean, sometimes actually it's about being more the spokesperson for the committee, and it's about raising that visibility. And again, if you have one thing, thinking from the public perspective, it's one of the issues it's very difficult to connect with Parliament is this collective institution, doesn't really have a face. And if you think of a committee and you think a collective of people, but then you give it a face, which might be the convener, then it makes it more relatable. And so that's one way of just thinking about raising the visibility. So it might not be a career and they might be, going to government or coming back or whatever, but it's about raising the visibility of that role of the convener and therefore valuing it so that members do want to do it in a way that is independent and does provide for that scrutiny.
Joe, do you want to?
Yeah, just a comment. I want to make a little point on the Jeremy Hunt type thing, because I think here there's a huge effort made, particularly by governments, and I think always has been to make sure if a minister leaves government that they try and leave space from that area that they were in government. So, and I think we've generally, in spite of the tight numbers, we've managed to do that. So maybe that's a lesson that we could pass to Westminster, that it's two ways. You touched, Christina, on remuneration, and I think as someone who's leaving, it's maybe easier for me to say this. I think there's a disconnect in terms of the fact that we have conveners who do a huge amount of extra work in that role, and I don't think it is appreciated, and they get no remuneration for it. Now, people don't come here, it's not about money, that's not why you become a politician. Most of the folk in our Parliament would be earning more doing whatever they were doing before. So it's not about money, but nonetheless, the fact that there's one area where you do extra work in terms of committee convenerships where there's no remuneration, then another path as a junior minister, a minister, a cabinet secretary where there is remuneration. So just whether that would potentially be something that would make our committee structures more effective and maybe help the conveners get the esteem that they deserve.
Yes, I mean, I'll preempt this by saying that I haven't done research in that area, so it's just from my overall view. But I do think there is value in that in terms of, again, it's about recognising the role of the convener. If there's nothing particularly different about a convener in terms of their role and their position related to other members, then why should it be special, if you see what I mean? And in terms of visibility, again, to build again, I don't like the term, but the brand, the image of committees and the role of committees, it would really help with that, to make sure that you recognise that a particular role, which involves a lot of hard work, to this specific person.
And sorry, just to throw in the election, but does elections help with that as well?
Yeah, elections, I think, is more complicated. It involves all sorts of other things, and again, I don't particularly like to compare with Westminster, but that's the clearest example we have of that. And you have seen a lot of grandstanding with particular chairs, then the whole committee becomes a chair. So there's also a danger in there with the committee then is just a chair, and the agenda and the work plan is what the chair wants to do in the case of Westminster. And there's party dynamics to it. I think the literature overall would say that elections in Westminster has worked in terms of making the chairs more legitimate, but also more proactive, coming back to that term, in terms of the work plan of committees. Whether it would work here, I don't know enough about your party dynamics here to say so. It's just one mechanism.
Okay, Tom, you've been nodding away, so...
Yes, I mean, there are pros and cons to it. I think I agree with Christina that the general consensus that in Westminster has worked, but again, Westminster is a very specific context in and of itself, and, as I said, there's plenty of stuff, plenty of things that Westminster can learn from this Parliament as well. And I think in terms of coming back to the point about trying to kind of rebalance the kind of legislative workload, perhaps, I don't know, maybe a convener who was elected and had a mandate from the chamber itself might have a better job of representing the committee with the government more in terms of being able to push back on some issues and as a kind of referred work programme as well. I mean, we see some evidence of that in Westminster, but again, the dynamics probably don't translate very well into this Parliament as well. And coming back to a point I think Ken made a little bit earlier on in terms of the media, I think it comes back to a point Christina was making too in terms of very high-profile chairs in Westminster who do court the media, understandably, because it kind of gets the committee on the news agenda, it makes people more familiar with the committee and the work that it's doing. But I think it comes back to the question of, well, what impact then does that have on the type of scrutiny that the committee undertakes, as well, obviously beyond the legislative workload as well, and does the kind of self-initiated work then chase media headlines opposed to selecting other types of work, which are, as Ken was kind of saying, very important, but might not be quite so showy and jazzy in terms of kind of media coverage. From my own perspective, researching that Post-Ledge is one of them, in which it doesn't sound particularly energising to members of the public until you kind of break it down to, well, actually you're reviewing laws that affect you. But again, that might deter committees from taking a variety of different types of scrutiny of their own self-initiation on that basis as well. So again, there are pros and cons to it.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose I think you'll always get that sense from places like Westminster where people are quite cagey on what the success was, just because there are competing ideas about what it means for them to be successful. It's not, there's not. So, I mean, you could see that as an opportunity to. I'm always this fan of writing stuff down to say what you mean, right? So you could write down what you think an elected convener should do, and therefore you can measure their success in terms of clearer criteria. I was looking back at the Commission on Scottish Parliament Reform from the olden days, and it was quite keen on elected conveners, and it pushed a little bit for their higher pay to reflect their higher workload. But it's such a the only people I really see pushing for more pay for MSPs and their roles are academics. It's not. I don't think MSPs can really feel confident that that's the sort of thing they would go for. So it's such a tricky. I don't know if you just appreciate someone on the record saying, you should pay conveners more, So there's that. I mean, the only other thing I would say is, you know about the importance of convenership when it goes wrong. So I think a lot of the time they're not appreciated just because things are ticking along nicely, and it's only when there's a problem you really see the thing. So I'll say very vaguely, when I experienced this most closely, there was a respected convener, and this inquiry was going really well, building up a head of steam, ready for speaking with the minister about it. The convener was replaced temporarily by someone from a different party, and the dynamic totally shifted, and it went away from all the stuff that everyone had talked about towards the issues of the day. And so you really could see the role of convenership going badly just by essentially maybe one person not following the same rules that the other person thought they were following. So I think a good way of kind of using elections would be as a vehicle to establish clear expectations, so that when someone is kind of not abusing the role, but using it for the party political purposes rather than the spirit of the convener.
And it is fair to see. Sorry, Joe, I was just going to say it is fair to see. Certainly, looking at Westminster, when there's evidence of that perhaps happening, there are procedures that result in conveners changing. So there is a loop of protection there that in other parliaments works. So there's a confidence that there are ways of preventing it getting out of control. Although no one would describe what they are. It's a bit like sausage making and laws, isn't it? Sorry, Joe, is there anything else?
Elections remuneration.
I probably was aware of it, but I needed reminded probably that I read in some of the background papers you had that the conveners group for this session from the start to where we are now, there's almost nobody standing that was there at the start. I mean, there's a huge turnover. And I'm thinking, well, so when you talk about remuneration, for example, it's, as you said, it's probably more about reward. It's certainly not to create a permanence in the role, I don't think, because as I said earlier, ad nauseum now probably, don't think that's possible. I think there is a good argument in terms of what Christina was saying about it just being a sign that the Parliament values this role as something other than just being a committee member. So on that, and I'm not talking about what that level should be, but I think I've got a fair idea of what it should be. It could be, sorry. Election-wise, again, I'll go back to elections. If the Parliament, it's probably more bureaucratic, administrative stuff, this, but if we went for convenership elections for every convenership, we'd be doing it at least twice a year for every committee. That's why when I was looking at the literature stuff, I thought, well, maybe the Welsh model's maybe a wee bit a good one, and so you have an election if that nomination is contested, and so you don't have across-the-board elections for all convenerships at every time. Probably something to consider.
Okay, that's helpful. The Parliament's gender-sensitive audit has looked at standing orders and looked at conveners, and they've recommended that 40% of conveners should be women, and that there should be no single-sex committees. So that's kind of recommendations that we're kind of looking at how that could be taken forward. So just good to hear any thoughts on how that could impact on diversity. Could it work? Could it cause other unintended consequences? And could it help committees be more effective? Ken, you're nodding the most, so.
I know. Yeah, my first reaction when I saw the recommendation that there shouldn't be any single-sex committees, so therefore there should be at least one of an opposite sex or gender. And I was thinking that externally I didn't know if that actually would look a wee bit like tokenism, and I think that it probably should be stronger than that. It should be stronger that, you know, I mean, again, some kinds of standing orders will say the Parliament shall have regard to, and I know that's not strong enough, but in a sense, having regard to the gender balance of the whole Parliament and replicating that in committees, as it should, I think, is in some way stronger than just saying that one person should be of an opposite sex. But absolutely, I think that where and how it's codified is probably necessary, because I'm not a great fan of codifying everything under the sun, because in the end, if you codify everything, it really ties your hands, it reduces the Flexibility Act, but it probably should be codified in some way, in a stronger sense.
Any thoughts, Christina?
Yeah, I mean, it is a difficult one, because obviously the composition of committees ultimately comes from the composition of the Parliament, so it will be related to that. I think, again, thinking from the public perspective, it does make a difference to see diversity in a committee, because then you're more likely to relate to it yourself. So I might be wrong, but I have a feeling, for instance, the current Citizen Participation and Petitions Committee only has male members, I think. And from a public perspective, that signals to me not very positive, welcoming, which I know it might be unfair, and I know the members, there's lots of other ways in which they can be bring in different lived experiences and all of that. But in terms of signalling to the public, in terms of that symbolic, we call it symbolic representation, how do you see yourself, or even descriptive representation, but in this case it's more symbolic. Do you relate yourself to that institution? And so it's not just gender, it's also obviously ethnic minorities and all sorts of other ways. But obviously, when the numbers are small and there's turnover, I realise the practicalities of it are not as easy to implement, and that's a difficulty.
So do you think if we're codifying it, then we need to specifically codify it for certain committees? So you've obviously mentioned one that has it's quite public-facing.
Ooh,
so
I hadn't thought about that. I don't want to say yes, because then it sort of feels like other committees are not important. I think all committees, obviously, are really important for the public. So I think that would be difficult. It's just recognising the importance of it, really.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I'm conscious that we can just say what we like, and it's your problem. But I suppose, in terms of, so you asked about unintended consequences, I think the main problem in some context was when you had this expectation of 40% in an organisation that usually was dominated by men. There were far too many men and there were too few women, and therefore, to meet the 40%, you actually had to put a huge burden on the small number of women doing it. And I think you deal with that by having a 50-50 parliament, which I think people are kind of... It's probably the most continuous commitment of devolution in the Parliament, was to reach some level of equal representation there. So I think if that's the case, then you know, the 40% should follow. It shouldn't be difficult, given the wider commitment. And I suppose, go back to this was something, again, it came up in the Commission of Parliament Reform, which was there was this reluctance. The main driver of this 50-50 is outside of the power of the Parliament as a body, because it's the recruitment of the parties. So I think it was kind of deliberate in how strongly worded it wanted to say to the Parliament, you should find a way to tell the parties that if they are not recruiting close to 50-50, then they are failing the Parliament. So I don't know. So I think it probably would come with that narrative, wouldn't it? That if you don't reach the 40% in the Parliament Bureau, someone is failing somewhere, and it's probably the party recruitment. And so therefore it becomes an impetus. If there are unintended consequences, it's not the fault of the rule, it's the fault of the parties not fulfilling it.
Yeah. Good. Tom, did you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, the challenge is obviously the composition of the Parliament after each election. Again, as Paul was saying, that a lot of that is down to, I guess, the candidates that parties are selecting and the ability to get those candidates over the line in terms of winning the election as well. We could just obviously be building on the point Christina made about symbolic representation. I think obviously that kind of diversity of committees is important from a substantive representation too, in terms of there are issues that are going to matter to different groups in society, and if those groups are not being represented on committees, then are those being placed on the work programme? And if they are, how high on the work programme are they? And if you're scrutinising legislation, are amendments coming forwards to deal with the concerns of those groups if you don't have a connection to those groups, other than obviously being an elected representative for a particular area of the country, as there's a wider knock-on effect in terms of kind of policy and agenda setting there as well.
Thank you.
Can I thank the panel very much for their contributions today and reiterate my initial comment that if thoughts come to you afterwards, even just on the way out, please feedback into the clerks. But can I thank you for your contributions today, and I'll bring the public part of this meeting to a close.